Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, there appears to be more and more evidence that America is depleted on the energy side and are desperately seeking ways to grab more sources by hook or by crook.
Yeah, absolutely. There's increasing evidence that if you're supposed to be the world's biggest oil producer or energy producer, why are you so desperately looking to take action to alleviate a problem that kind of indicates you don't expect that to be the case in the near future? Now, near future doesn't mean today or tomorrow or next week, but it could be a matter of years away. And of course, if your oil and gas reserves start to deplete rather sharply, then that problem becomes a far bigger issue far sooner. Now, typically, the United States is not renowned for being very proactive. It tends to be reactive, and it tends to be reactive 2 minutes or half an hour or 2 years too late. They're always too late when they're reactive. And when they react, it's completely inappropriate how they do react. The other thing to factor into this equation is that the United States, and we've spoken about this previously, I've done it more so on my own podcast, is under enormous pressure from the OPEC plus nations who are deliberately trying to stick it to the United States and wreck their shale oil and gas sectors. That, and we'll explain why, is the case. So the US is having to deal with that also in the process. And we thought it would be interesting to highlight some of the examples of why, particularly since the onset of Trump 2.0, the US has been behaving in an energy sense, but in a broader sense, in ways that give the impression there's suddenly an understanding and a realization that for all the bluster and the hot air where people go, America has everything. It's got huge resources. It doesn't have huge resources. And certainly there's a lot of resources that are not proven, that they actually A, exist, and B, and more importantly, are economically viable to extract. And by highlighting these examples, it shows the United States is desperate. And just to put a sort of intro on this in a broader sense, it's worth noting the following. Why is the United States so interested in Greenland? It's interested not because of security matters and fears about what the Chinese and the Russians might do in the Arctic region. It's because they believe Greenland has huge resources that they could extract and exploit in the future. That was the reason. To a large extent, the whole Greenland subject's gone rather quiet. Then you come to the issue of Ukraine. Again, a belief that Ukraine is rich with resources. And the United States went, well, let's sign a minerals deal with them so we can exploit that in the future. Of course, the reality is how much resources really do exist there and how much are now under Russian control anyway. And you can guarantee this deal will never see the light of day ever in the future. But what this demonstrates is the United States has a desperation to seek resources around the globe that it thinks it can then exploit for its own benefit, precisely because it doesn't have those resources. And energy is a really good example of where there's a belief that the United States is something it was very briefly, but increasingly it's not the case. And I'll go into some detail in a minute because I'll give way to Ken, where I want to talk specifically about US oil, shale oil, what's going on in the country, and how absolutely the case that OPEC Plus is gunning to create a price war to wreck US shale oil. So those markets that are going to wreck it, the Saudis, the Russians, etc., which can sell oil at a far cheaper price, will gobble up the market at the expense of US shale oil.
There's a couple of Interesting points. I mean, take a look at why we were in Syria. The whole thing about overthrowing the Assad regime. Anybody who's done any modicum of understanding, Bashir Assad was not, doing even close to the things to his people that they were claiming. But where were the U.S. military bases? They were in the oil fields under the guise of protecting the Kurds, but they were exploiting the oil. Then we have, of course, this recent move by the United States to send some ships into the Caribbean down towards South America and threatening Venezuela. Now, we've talked about this recently. Is there any expectation that the U.S. can do a land invasion of Venezuela? No. But they have in their minds that they could do possibly cause some type of internal coup which would bring in a pro-Western leader, which would then see about the exploitation of Venezuelan oil. Go back to Ukraine, where Joe Biden, his son, was with Burisma. They were trying to create policies that would allow for Ukrainian oil to somehow matriculate to the United States. And then, of course, when you take a look at an interesting piece of news that came out recently, that Exxon has asked for permission and gotten it apparently from the Trump administration to start secret talks with Russia to start integrating back into joint oil exploration and production. So, if these things right alone don't speak about how desperate the United States is for energy, I don't know what is.
Well, yeah, and that's the whole point why, in part, the United States thinks, well, the big benefit of rapprochement with the Russians is developing energy projects in the Russian Far East and the Russian Arctic. Again, why would the United States want to do that if it's the biggest oil producer in the world? It's doing it because it's realizing it needs access to other sources of energy. And if they develop these projects, then that could be mutually beneficial to the Russians, clearly, but also to the Americans. And the potential in Russia is enormous because, as I've said previously, there's at least 200 years of oil and gas that Russia could fuel the entire world with. That's how big its reserves are. And bear in mind, there's many places it's never exploited reserves. That figure could be 250 years or something else. But when you look at what is going on with respect to this price war with Saudi, Russia, and other OPEC countries, in recent times, US shale producers are idling basically drilling rigs there, and the number of crews who are fracking wells has hit an over 4 year low. Producers have cut billions of dollars worth of spending this year alone. And the argument is, while oil prices are in the range around $60 or to $65, they're not going to be able to send out more rigs and do more drilling because the price is too low. The other thing that's a big problem is because the production costs are so high. If you get these big changes in the price of crude, then it's not economically viable for the United States to do so. So the argument is, if OPEC keeps oil prices in the range of $60 for a number of years, then that's going to curtail massive investment in US shale, but not only US shale, other locations too. And it's interesting to note that OPEC recently said we're going to keep raising supplies in September. Who's one of the biggest drivers of this? That's the Saudis, who wants to drive this production increase because in doing so and keeping the prices suppressed, it's going to win back a significant market share that it feels to some extent it lost to US shale, because US shale is not going to have the output. So people are going to go, or nations or those who require oil will sit there and go, well, where do we get it from? And the Saudis will sell it to them. Hence why basically production or sales of oil is going to be driven by OPEC Plus, and which is obviously Saudi and Russia. They're the main players who are driving this. And there's absolutely no doubt it's not the first time that OPEC Plus has been sticking it to the shale sector, and in this case, shale oil. And this is kind of ironic that all the way along, the Trump administration, even the Biden administration, was trying to drive oil prices down, not least because they were trying to replenish their strategic petroleum reserve that they basically gutted during the Biden administration, but not realizing that oil is now at a price where it's just not viable for the vast bulk of shale oil sector in the US. So this is a multifold problem. There is, and people will disagree with this, but there's clearly evidence to suggest that shale oil and gas is peaking or has peaked in the United States. Now, depending on various forecasts as to what that means in reality and how quickly is the decline going to get to the point that the United States, within a matter of years, and you may say 5 years, you may say 10 years, who knows, is going to get to the point where its output is so small that not only is it not going to be able to satisfy the demands of Europe, who thinks, well, we'll still pay 5, 3, 4, 5 times the cost of what we can get for Russian pipeline gas. At some point, they're not even going to be able to supply these countries with that. So there's an inevitability at some point the Europeans are going to go crawling on their hands and knees begging the Russians for pipeline gas, and we need to fix Nord Stream as one example. It's an inevitability. But if the United States itself reaches a point where it cannot satisfy its internal demand, now, okay, it does have to export significant amounts of its oil because it needs heavy oil in returns, because without it, it couldn't service jet fuel, bunker fuel, and its diesel sector. If it doesn't have the other oil in the first place, then it becomes a huge matter of national security for the US in terms of not having the energy anymore to be a major player, but also then it would be at the behest, ironically, of the likes of the Russians and the Saudis and other major oil producers. Hence why all of a sudden the United States is, well, we've had the Ukraine war. We need to walk away from this, not least because they have to walk away from it because they can't win the war. But also, I think it's about time we started making friends with the Russians again, because who's got vast amounts of oil? The Russians. So if we work on joint projects and we invest, then we might be able to address in future the issue of shortages in terms of our oil production, and therefore you would have to import far more oil in the process. These are not coincidences. They're absolutely, unequivocally factors that have come about because the United States won't admit it, but it is in a desperate state. And you have to give them some credit for once. The US is actually realizing it's going to have to act quite quickly rather than its usual ambivalence or arrogance or ignorance. And it just goes, well, this is not our problem. We're America. We won't be experiencing difficulties like that. They realize they're going to. So it's one thing saying to the Russians, well, we can't exactly go to war with you and seize your assets. Although we did think at one point that might work with Ukraine because, Russia will fall apart and we can balkanize it. Well, they've kind of finally realized that's nonsense. So we have to make friends with you. But then conversely, they may get idiotic ideas that, well, if we can, like you say, can collapse Venezuela, then we can, I'm not sure how they think they can put a Western sympathetic leader in or a US sympathetic leader. And then we'll have access to all Venezuelan energy. But the US has Chevron there already. They could do things legitimately. If they stop being so aggressive and threatening, the market could be open for them. Two, to be able to exploit legitimately Venezuela's vast oil reserves. But they're not the only ones there. The Russians there, as we said, the Chinese and other players. But the US is panicking privately, and it's probably looking all the way around the world going, well, where's all the oil deposits? Where's the oil producers? Can we in some way influence the governance structure, or can we eke out some kind of way of being able to gain access to their energy, to their oil and gas? The problem with the US is they don't like doing things legitimately. They've got no choice of Russia because Russia's a nuclear power that would eviscerate them in 15 minutes, so they can't play hardball with them. But any country it perceives, particularly global south countries or countries that they perceive to be weak, they may have crazy ideas about how they can exploit a situation because they won't want to share the profits. They won't want to share those resources and have win-win cooperation. They want to steam in and seize control and have access to all those assets, including, of course, oil and gas. And it's probably also why recently the US has started to go, we need a strategic resources. We need to do it. And they're doing it with things like silver as well, because they've suddenly gone, oh, there isn't any silver anywhere in the world. We need silver. Where are we going to get it from? Oh, I don't know, but we need to start thinking about this. So it's not just oil and gas, it's every commodity on the planet, but they are desperate. And their desperation is because of the idiotic decisions they're trying to make or policy initiatives, or the way they're just basically going around the world saying, we desperately need resources and we're going to come out with outrageous and outlandish plans to get control of those resources, and hence idiotic statement relating to Greenland, relating to Ukraine, and then, of course, people making inferences with regards to Taiwan, also Venezuela, and the list goes on. And this is just indicative not of a country who sees itself as a major or the biggest oil producer in the world. It's a country who's behaving like it thinks in the very near future those oil reserves will diminish to relatively nothing, not exactly nothing, but certainly it would cause the United States enormous internal problems if it suddenly is no longer an hegemonic power, but it needs access to oil. And it will have to actually have a mature relationship and be friends with the world, because if it's not, the world will say to the US, sorry, you're not having our energy. You can go and freeze, starve, or anything, all the other problems you're going to have without access to oil.
A validation of the points you just made in there. Go back to 2023 on the campaign trail. President Trump in North Carolina. He said, when I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. And look what he's done in regards to sanctions. His Western lackey, Guaido, is facing indictments and possible jail time. And the Trump administration is doing yeoman's work, desperately trying to save him, which is their guy. So if outside of him, there's probably nobody that could easily, if there was a fall or regime change in Venezuela, to be pro-Western. But take a look at a number of other different factors. The United States relied heavily a decade ago on Mexico and Canada for a lot of its oil. And Mexico their reserves have declined immensely, so they're not really a big player anymore for the U.S. to be able to get or purchase their oil. And ironically, Trump has alienated, with Carney now leading Canada, they've alienated Canada. Canada doesn't want to sell us anything. So there's two sources right there over the past 10 years that have pretty much dried up. And then when you go to what is happening on the East Coast, there's just not enough energy to provide for the for the grid. So they're seeing prices go up 3 times in just the last 12 to 18 months for many people on the East Coast. And then, of course, the coup d'etat. The Trump administration and the world is rushing headlong into AI and data centers, which are going to demand an extraordinary amount of energy. And the Trump administration, we've already seen, has bought into and nationalized in a way the ownership in corporations that are deemed as national security or important to the country as a whole. If energy becomes even worse than it is now, especially as shale collapses, then who's to say that the United States government isn't going to hold energy, as you pointed out, as a national security threat and start nationalizing things all across the board and justifying itself to use military and foreign policies to try to get as many sources as they can by strength rather than cooperation.
Well, yeah, that's true, but let's face it, the United States couldn't fight a war if its life depended on it. It has no capability to fight any ground war anywhere in the world, which is why the Houthis basically created a situation with the very limited resources they have to get the United States begging them, we'll drop all sanctions, we'll do this, we'll do that, just stop targeting our ships and stop targeting the Israelis and whoever other Western vessels. Please, pretty please, do not do this anymore. That is not a country who can fight a war. So it can go, what's it going to do? Launching a ground offensive with 4,000 Marines in Venezuela, about 500,000 strong military. I mean, the numbers just don't stack up. Never mind, they couldn't win a war on that basis anyway. So the US cannot fight wars. The world now knows the US is incapable of fighting any war of any description in a ground warfare situation. So, and it's going to be pretty obvious to the world if the US starts popping up everywhere and trying to start wars that and start to create confrontation and conflict. Well, there's a common theme that always underpins all these countries. They're all energy producers, and the world isn't going to tolerate this kind of nonsense anymore. And certainly the Russians will not allow that either, and neither will the Chinese. And you can guarantee if the Americans start doing this, the Russians will go, forget investing in our country. We're not entertaining any idea of doing anything to work with you in the future. So the Russians have huge leverage over the Americans with regards to energy now. So they're going to have to play ball and behave themselves. But this is all part of this big mind shift that's going to, or mindset shift that's going to have to happen in the US. And they realize they're no longer an hegemonic power and they're going to have win-win cooperation. And if they need energy in the future, they'll have to be on their best behavior because to go around threatening other countries is not going to work. And everybody knows the US is the naked emperor who can't fight a war anymore. And that's being borne out by all the things that have happened globally since World War II, basically. Whenever, look at Vietnam, the US couldn't fight that war. It was a war they couldn't win. What wars the US won? Yeah, there was, obviously with Iraq, there was the Gulf War One that they achieved their objectives, but that wasn't actually an objective to overthrow Saddam. They achieved their objective and left very intelligently. Okay, I'm not advocating any war, but they had a list of objectives, they achieved them, and they left. And it was, in that regard, it was successful. But every war where the United States just bulldozes in and tries to have no actual realistic objective, they're going to lose. And what are they going to do? Keep losing wars all around the world? It's just not. They're terrified of looking like they lost the Ukraine war. They're not going to risk going to war with other countries where those old tried and trusted techniques of regime change, etc., just don't work anymore.
Absolutely. Paul, were there any other final points you wanted to make regarding this?
No, I think that's fine. That'll do for
Absolutely.
today.
To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it'd be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.